Welcome to the Trafalgar Room of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'm Ben Barry, the Senior Fellow for Land Warfare, and Dr. Richard Hooker has come from the US National Defence University to brief you on this. This is the hard copy version of Lessons Encountered, but you're not being asked to part with $29.99, be that dollars or pounds, because the work is downloadable for free, along with a lot of their other works, from the excellent National Defence University website. And I've read the introduction and conclusions of it, and in my two capacities, first of all of having done the British Army's final lessons learned exercise from Operation Telic, its role in the stabilisation of Iraq, and also currently working on a book on the military lessons of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So from those two perspectives, I can say this is a jolly useful piece of work that very much concentrates at the strategic level and has some really hard-learned lessons, particularly for senior military and political leadership. And Richard's come to tell us about it. He'll talk for up to half an hour, and then we'll have half an hour for Q&A. And in the finest traditions of the IISS, he's not using any PowerPoints.
Lovely.
Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Ben, very much, and thank you all for coming today. This work began in the summer of 2014 with a conversation with General Dempsey, who was at the time our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, just retired in October, this past October. And General Dempsey, in commissioning this study, asked us to take a hard look really at three questions. The first, what exactly were the costs of our involvement or engagement in both Iraq and Afghanistan? Second, to try to make a judgment on whether we thought the costs were worth the gains achieved. And finally, could we identify some lessons learned that would be of value or use to future four-star community and the senior officers who supported them? So the target audience excludes a number of communities or perhaps touches them tangentially. The real focus was on future senior leaders in the U.S. Armed Forces. We were given a year to do the study, which is not a long time for something with a scope like this. We did have the advantage of having access to some 100 interview transcripts. Most of these had been pulled together by a parallel effort that the U.S. Army is undertaking. That's a 2 or 3 year project which is not finished yet. We were able to conduct our own interviews with General Dempsey, with Stephen Hadley, who was the National Security Advisor in the second part of the Bush administration, with General Allen, General Austin, General Petraeus, General McChrystal, and some others of that stature. Significantly, there were a number of notable personalities who declined to be interviewed for our study, and those included General Franks, the CENTCOM commander early on for the invasion of Iraq, General Meyer, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the first part of the Bush administration, and Admiral Mullen, who was the chairman following General Pace. So notable holes there. We hope that our work holds up. We'll see. One of the tests of that is to come around and meet with groups like you to see what you think. I would like to repeat what Ben just said. The complete text of the book is available at the NDU Press website, and it's downloadable and not copyrighted, so it can be used however you wish. And if you would like a hard copy of the book, if you'll just send the editor of the NDU Press an email, he'll be happy to send it to you free of charge. So that's a pretty good deal. So what I propose to do is to speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then perhaps we can open it up for Q&A and discussion. So let's begin with the first question. What were the costs, the hard, tangible costs of our conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan? Obviously, Afghanistan, that operation is not completed, so these numbers will continue to roll, although of late our casualties there have been very, very low. But as of the time we went to print, the United States had suffered 6,837 service member fatalities in these two conflicts. We think 40 government civilian employees, 3,212 contractor employees. And of the international coalition partners, 1,449 dead, 632 of whom were British soldiers. Over 52,000 U.S. service members and around 30,000 contractors were wounded in action or injured. Of note, almost 20,000 of these wounded on the U.S. side were wounded so severely that they were evacuated out of the theater and did not return. That's the better part of the combat echelon of two full divisions, which is a striking statistic when you consider that the entire U.S. active Army is only 10 divisions. Conservative estimates of the death toll among host nations' civilians and their security forces range from 180,000 to 230,000. Mostly civilians, but a significant number of security force personnel. Not killed at the hands of the coalition, but certainly on our watch. The United States spent at least $1.6 trillion in direct costs in these two conflicts to date. Estimates of the eventual long-term cost vary depending upon the methodology that you apply, but they'll almost certainly approach $3 trillion by about 2050, primarily because of the cost of extended care for veterans of those two conflicts, as well as debt service of the money that we had to borrow to wage those two wars. So by any calculation, the war on terrorism led by the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan has surpassed Vietnam as America's second most expensive war, only excepting the Second World War, of course. And these are remarkable figures when you consider the projections that were provided by the administration early on, which were that these would be short, decisive campaigns, and in the case of Iraq, in particular, would be financed primarily by Iraqi oil revenues, which of course was very far off the mark. Was it worth it? I mean, we all have to draw our own judgments and conclusions about that. And to be fair, there clearly have been some gains. So a very odious tyrant was overthrown in Saddam Hussein. There's no question about that. There's been a very significant amount of development of infrastructure, construction. You can point to any number of statistics about improved access to medical care and education and so on and so forth in both of those conflicts. But when you assess these gains against the rather lofty level of ambition that was described at the outset in both cases, I think it's hard to conclude that these were big successes. At a minimum, I think you can say the outcomes in both have been unsatisfying. Defeat is a large word. I don't know if I'd want to use that word right now because of its many loaded connotations. But certainly the costs were very, very high, and the gains do not seem to have matched them. In geopolitical terms, for sure, our foray into the Middle East has resulted in a very unstable Iraqi state at the very least. We're going to talk about the surge and what the surge accomplished in a moment. But whatever its accomplishments, the political settlement that was intended to follow the reduction in violence obviously was not achieved in Iraq, and that laid the foundations or set the conditions for what followed after. And in particular, the disenfranchisement of the Sunni communities in the west and the north created conditions which allowed ISIL to come to the fore. And perhaps we can get into that a little bit in the Q&A as well. We chose to focus on 3 case studies to try to draw out or tease out some judgments. We're careful about using the term lessons learned. The title of the book is actually Lessons Encountered, and that's a conscious choice on our part. We don't think we do a particularly good job in the United States of learning lessons. We don't think we're particularly inclined in that way. We don't think that enough time has elapsed for this to be true history. Hopefully it's more than just pure journalism. It's something in between. We hope it's scholarship. It's serious scholarship. So the book is, we think, very well cited, and we hope it stands up to the test of time, given the amount of time that we had to prepare it. I won't go into the structure of the book very much, but you'll see if you get a chance to look at the table of contents that we selected some key facets that we thought were most important, and these include the legal dimensions and the legal frameworks that apply to these decisions, how we do national security decision making in the United States, how well we adapted as these two conflicts evolved and went on, and also there is a discussion about security assistance, which we felt was crucial because in both conflicts it was seen as the exit strategy or the way out and the way back home. A few words about these three case studies. The first, the decision to invade Iraq in 2003. And really, I think what we see here are two key factors. The first is a concentration of the war power in the executive branch, which has been a political evolution in the United States over many, many years and many decades, certainly accelerated by the two world wars and then by the advent of nuclear weapons. And this concentration, if you want to call it that, has been upheld in a number of Supreme Court decisions. It doesn't appear to be going away. Nevertheless, I think you can make a strong case that the original intention of the framers, which was that the war power would be dispersed among the different branches of government so that emotional or hasty decisions might be checked, does not seem to have really applied, certainly in the case of Iraq. We deliberately chose not to examine the process, the decision process to go into Afghanistan, because we didn't find very much evidence that there was one, frankly. There was not a lot of interagency deliberation. I think you'll agree with me that any president would have felt compelled to undertake military action very soon after 9/11. There was not a lot of discussion or debate about how we would do that. We began to flow forces, and you're all familiar with I think, the contours or the outlines of that. We experienced initial success in Afghanistan with a small footprint and partnering with the Northern Alliance. This reinforced Secretary Rumsfeld's ideas about transformation, technology, the network, and small forces as the wave of the future, with unfortunate results later on in Iraq. So let's talk about the decision to invade Iraq in 2003. If you were in the Pentagon as I was at the time, it was something of a mystery. There was a clear case for Afghanistan. There was a much less clear case to invade Iraq. It has to be said that there really wasn't a lot of debate about the case that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Our intelligence community agreed on that. Our political and military decision makers agreed on that. Our closest allies and partners agreed on that. It's one of the anomalies of history that it turned out, in fact, not to be the case. So we'll chalk it up as a major intelligence failure, one among many, and we'll move on. We'll accept that as a planning assumption, which turned out to be false. What were the other major planning assumptions that informed this decision? That it would be a sharp but short conflict, that it would be an easy peace, that the process of transitioning to Iraqi control would be quick and seamless, that we could back out within about 6 months or so, that we could use a relatively small number of troops to achieve our aim, that the decision to disband the Iraqi army and to impose a very severe de-Baathification would happen more or less without serious consequence, and so on, that the Shia communities in particular, who are the majority in Iraq, would welcome us as liberators. General Abizaid has since called these a set of heroic assumptions that were informed probably as much by ideology and a best case approach to planning as anything else. It's remarkable that the military, which has a much more of a planning culture than the civilian agencies, and is used to planning for the worst case, not the best case, did not make that case convincingly at the time. And in the book, we fault the senior military leadership for not playing what we see as the role that's been set out for it in our system. Not to co-opt the decision from the civilian decision makers, certainly, That is their prerogative. But vigorous debate, and even respectful dissent is certainly something that we see as falling within an appropriate construct of civil-military relations. The record doesn't seem to show much debate or dissent on the part of the senior military. So that's something that we think we need to look at very, very closely in any retrospective on the Iraq campaign. So we found ourselves experiencing initial battlefield success, as we all know. It was a very rapid move up to Baghdad. The climatic battle for Baghdad never really took place. Saddam's statue was pulled down, and we found ourselves without any meaningful post-conflict plan, what we call in the U.S. military Phase 4 planning. Why was that? It's not true that no planning was done. The State Department did some excellent planning, identifying some 119 different major tasks that would need to be addressed in the post-conflict environment. The National Defense University did a similar study. The Army War College turned out an excellent study as well, and there were others. These were consciously withheld from the deliberation of our interagency at the most senior levels, at the level of the Deputies Committee and the Principals Committee. The Secretary of Defense was able to exclude these from those deliberations. And in a telling passage in his memoirs, the chairman at the time, General Myers, confessed his inability to make the combatant commander, General Franks, focus on post-conflict planning at all, a remarkable admission on the part of the chairman. So we find ourselves in 2004 and 2005 in a rapidly deteriorating and worsening condition, as you will all recall. And this really moved to a new level in the spring of 2006 with the bombing of the Samarra Mosque, which really propelled Iraq into open civil war as the Shia came off the sidelines and began to engage coalition forces and the Sunni forces with a vengeance. So the situation by the summer of 2006 was rapidly spinning out of control. What was the plan at that time? The campaign plan called for an accelerated handover to the Iraqi security forces and a subsequent backing out into what we called at the time an overwatch position and an advise and assist position. Coincident to that was a detailed plan to off-ramp, in our terminology, American brigades, so that we would draw down our troop strength. The president became increasingly alarmed in the summer of 2006. But to understand this period, it's important, I think, that you understand the unique relationship between Vice President Cheney, the most powerful national security vice president we had up to that point, and Secretary Rumsfeld. Earlier in their careers, some 25, 30 years before, Rumsfeld had actually been Cheney's superior and had actually brought him into the Ford administration and made his career. So in one of those curious paradoxes of history, Cheney is now the vice president. Rumsfeld's brought back to the Department of Defense after some 25 years and reinstalled as the secretary. And really not much was possible in the interagency process without the concurrence of those two. So they were powerful enough positionally to lock up the interagency and to prevent movement or open debate about alternative courses of action. This all changed with the midterm elections, the congressional elections in November of 2006. It's a historical event that I feel has been underreported in the histories of it, because this was the event, and at the time I was working in the White House as a military officer assigned to the Iraq office of the NSC staff. This was the event that caused the light switch to go on with President Bush. Literally on that day, he made the decision to fire Secretary Rumsfeld and to install Robert Gates as his new secretary. That transition took about 3 or 4 weeks to take effect. And at a stroke, this combination, this power nexus between Rumsfeld and Cheney began to go away. Vice President Cheney never again enjoyed the high influence in national security matters that he had enjoyed in the first 6 years of the Bush administration, in my opinion. So this created the opportunity for movement. The NSC staff had been calling for a policy review since the early summer of 2006. This now began with a vengeance. The White House and the interagency principals and deputies more or less went into continuous session, and they assessed a broad range of options. It's well known now that the one that carried the day with the president was a presentation by Fred Kagan and by General Jack Keane, a retired Army four-star. I have to tell you, it was a compelling presentation, and it was detailed and it was granular, and it involved not only a recommendation for a dramatic increase in troops, but also how they would be used, where they would be used, and to what effect they would be used. And I think we have to say that this was absent in the courses of action that were being put forward by the Joint Staff and by U.S. Central Command. In my opinion, that's just a fact. But we have a real historical anomaly going on here. We have a united recommendation on the military side from the secretary through the chairman and the combatant commander all the way down to the theater commander to do one thing, and that best military advice is rejected by the president. So I hope we can get into that a little bit in the Q&A, because it's a very remarkable thing. The president, in addition to replacing his Secretary of Defense, replaces his theater commander. General Casey is kicked upstairs to be the Army chief, and General Petraeus is brought in and promoted to take over the theater command, and we see the results of the surge. You all will have your own opinions about whether or not the surge was ultimately successful. My own opinion is that if it was intended to dramatically reduce the level of violence and to set conditions for the political movement or the political solutions that we all knew were necessary to achieve success, I think it clearly achieved that. It must be considered, I think, in any honest assessment as a remarkable achievement on the military side, but it was not matched by the political movement that we needed to truly be successful. And I think history will show, once all the documents are made public, that we knew Maliki for what he was pretty early in the game. We knew him as a highly sectarian leader who would be very unlikely to promote a multi-ethnic secular state that was governed by the rule of law where minority rights would be respected. There was very little reason to think Maliki would rule that way, and in the event he did not. When the U.S. troops were withdrawn and that leverage was removed from the equation, Maliki showed himself to be what many of us thought he was all along, with the results that we see in Iraq today. I have to point out that as early as 2002, War College students were writing papers asking, why do we intend to, in effect, dismember the Iraqi state? Because our success in reassembling the pieces and putting it back together again, that's a doubtful proposition. And the only winner or gainer in this game would be the Iranians, as the powerful Sunni counterweight to Iranian hegemonic ambitions in the region was removed. Iran could only be the great gainer, and I think we've seen that. We've seen that now. So it's not, as we say in the United States, Monday morning quarterbacking. These were outcomes that could have been seen, and we feel should have been seen far, far in advance. Let's move on to the decision to surge in Afghanistan in 2009. An interesting case with some differences and with some parallels. In this time period, President Obama found himself in something like a similar situation. In the first 6 months of his administration, he's made a decision to remove General McKiernan and to replace him with General McChrystal. McChrystal comes in June of 2009. He assembles a team of largely civilian experts. He undertakes a comprehensive strategic review that lasts some 60 days or so, which results in a recommendation that we execute another dramatic surge in Afghanistan as we had done in Iraq. It should be noted that in the previous 12 months, so at the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration, there had already been a very significant increase in troop numbers, first to 68,000, then up to 82,000, partly as a result of the deteriorating security situation in Afghanistan, but partly because as we withdrew from Iraq, we now had the ability to provide more resources to Afghanistan. Up to that point, Afghanistan had always been the stepchild. As Admiral Mullen famously remarked in 2008, in Iraq we do what we must, in Afghanistan we do what we can. That began to change. We enter a difficult period of civil-military relations in the fall of 2009. How did that come about? Well, the first event was the leaking of McChrystal's strategic assessment. Now, nobody really knows how that happened, and in a sense, I suppose it doesn't really matter. McChrystal, to this day, insists that neither he nor his staff leaked the assessment to the press. Secretary Gates, in his memoirs, says that a source that he has full confidence in told him as he was leaving office that it was in fact a member of McChrystal's staff that leaked the report. Whoever leaked it, the effect was a perception in the minds of the president and his senior political aides in the West Wing that the military was attempting to try the case in public and to build public support for McChrystal's preferred course of action rather than conduct this discussion in private inside the interagency, which of course is how the system is supposed to operate. This perception was reinforced by a presentation that General McChrystal gave, I think right where we're sitting right now.
Yep, one floor up.
In October, I think it was October of 2009, where it was reported in a Q&A session that General McChrystal had said that if he was not reinforced to the tune of about 40,000 soldiers, then we were probably going to lose the war in Afghanistan. General Petraeus made much the same kind of comment around the same time in an interview with a Washington Post reporter who, unknown to him, had previously been a Bush administration speechwriter. So that reinforced this perception and, in a sense, poisoned the relationship between the White House and General McChrystal. And this is all explained in great detail in Secretary Gates' memoirs if you want to take a closer look at that. So we go forward. President Obama makes the decision in the end to surge 30,000 U.S. troops and another 10,000 coalition troops were made available. But at the same time that he announces the increase, he announces that they will be withdrawn in only 18 months. An announcement which was perceived by our Afghan counterparts, in effect, as pulling the rug out from under the operation. So it was perceived one way domestically in the United States. It was seen very differently in the theater of war itself. So what can we take away from these three case studies? All different, all with some similarities. We were asked to try to make some judgments or some informed recommendations for the benefit of the future senior military leadership in the United States, and we attempted to do that. And they are the following, I would say. The first is that we feel we need to pay much closer attention to the professional development of those that are going to end up at the very top of our system. I think most of you will agree with me that in terms of tactical and operational competence, our senior military leaders on the American side grade out very high. They know how to conduct military operations and they know how to be successful. And although we often get it wrong in the beginning, our capacity for adaptation and improvement in the midst of conflict is rated, I think, pretty high. How good are our 4-stars at strategy and at interacting with civilian decision makers and political leaders? Well, like anything else, that's probably a function of their professional background, their education, their development, their personalities, and their level of talent. It's not so easy to develop those kind of skills, and I'm now talking about the ability to work effectively in multinational environments, their ability to be media savvy, to be informed and effective working inside the interagency process with civilian counterparts, a thorough understanding of our budgeting and programming system, All of these things are not uniformly found among our senior four-star community, probably because it's thought that mastering those competencies at warfighting requires so much of their career track. But in part, there are other things which I suspect our colleagues in the British military would share. So there is clearly an anti-intellectual bias in our military. The system that we use to select our most senior leaders is heavily dependent on sort of patronage relationships. So if you're fortunate enough to be identified as an up-and-comer by a powerful general earlier in your career, and that sponsor or sponsors can then assist you with being posted to the right kinds of assignments that give you the right kinds of visibility. And if you're fortunate that those sponsors are represented on your promotion boards beginning at the brigadier level, then you've got a chance to move up. None of this has very much to do with interagency, media, congressional, and budget and programming expertise. In fact, it's considered to be a very cool thing to fight as hard as you can to avoid assignments in Washington. And of course, Washington is where you learn those skills. So we have some work to do on that front, and I don't underestimate the difficulty of that. I would recommend to you a recent paper that was written by Janine Davison. The name may be known to some of you. She was recently a senior official in the Department of Defense. I think she was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategy. Her paper is called The Broken Dialogue, and it's entertaining, but it's very insightful. So she describes a conversation that took place in the White House Situation Room on the subject of Sudan, and it goes something like this. The political leadership turns to the military leadership and says, the situation in Sudan is very bad. We need to do something. What can we do? And the military says, well, what exactly do you want us to do? And the politicians say, we want you to make the bad stuff stop in Sudan. And the military leaders look at each other, and then they look back across the table and they say, well, how much are you willing to spend? And the civilians say, well, we don't know. How much do these things cost? And the military says, what things? And you see this sort of circular dialogue that's going on. And really it's a product of the fact that the civilian leadership and the military leadership come from very different backgrounds and very different worlds. In a sense, they're talking to each other in different languages. And so squaring this circle and coming together is a collaborative process that's very difficult and not very easy. We spent about 2 hours interviewing General Dempsey, and he said, I wish I could make the generals and the admirals understand that the resentment that they feel when they get to this level at the way the interagency process works is all very interesting, but they're not going to change it. They're not going to show up as a 4-star and change the way that the United States of America works. They all think that they may be able to do that, but they're not able to do that. Far better for them to understand the system with all of its inadequacies and disabilities and try to find a way to maximize their effectiveness working inside this system. So this depends upon building trust relationships, which take a long time to build, but which can be lost overnight like that. And it is partly dependent upon an ability to offer best military advice with a proper appreciation of the other dimensions that the politicians can't ignore. So I'll give you an example of these two different universes trying to interact. When the White House Chief of Staff says in a meeting of the National Security Council, the president has to pay attention to his political base when he makes this decision. You can imagine the reaction on the part of the generals who hear, we're going to make decisions about the use of force and ultimately about the deaths of young Americans on the basis of listening to your political base, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party or the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Really, that's what we're all about here today? When the generals say, we think it's important to frame this decision in terms of a success that is worthy of the sacrifices that will be demanded, which is certainly how the generals feel, the politicians here So what you're really saying is you care more about dead soldiers than I do. Am I hearing you right, General? And so on and so on. This is really difficult stuff. It's really difficult stuff. We're not going to solve it. We can improve the process and make it better if we can find a way to develop both sides of this equation differently. And we make some suggestions in that regard. It is possible to identify a small number of our 4 stars that are generally acknowledged as having mastered this difficult environment, but there aren't many. It's David Petraeus, it's James Stavridis, it's probably Marine 4-star Jim Mattis, arguably John Allen, and a small number of others. What do they all have in common? Well, they all have a reputation for being lifelong learners, men of high intelligence, of ambition and drive, certainly, but with some non-standard features in their career development that are not typical, are very atypical. So, for example, General Allen is a holder of 2 or 3 graduate degrees. General Petraeus and Admiral Stavridis, PhD graduates from top-tier institutions. General Mattis doesn't enjoy that, but has a library of 5,000 volumes and is probably the best-read 4-star that we've had in a generation. So it takes that kind of background, and it's going to take a culture that will enable or allow at least some of these people to rise to the top if we're going to see real improvement. I'd like to cite the case of H.R. McMaster, who will be known to many of you, I think, as an example of an independent-minded, on the one hand, militarily very proficient and competent officer, probably the best warfighter of our generation, certainly, but at the same time a highly intellectual and very insightful military officer. He's been promoted to 3 stars, never on time, but never allowed to command anything and never allowed to serve with troops as a general officer, which of course circumscribes his horizons significantly. Most of these decisions were made by the senior Army leadership, who see him as somebody very, very unlike themselves, and for all of his acknowledged talent, certainly a dangerous and perhaps untrustworthy individual. At least that's my assessment. So the baby has been split by continuing to promote him, but make sure that he serves in assignments somewhat out of the mainstream, where it will be difficult, if not impossible, for him to rise to the highest level. So I think with that, as sort of a scene setter, I'll stop talking and thank you for your kind attention. I'll invite your questions and your comments. Thank you.
Before we do, I'd just like to make an observation that the anecdote about the conversation about Sudan that Richard used is very similar to an anecdote about a conversation about Bosnia made in 1992, which is cited in General Sir Rupert Smith's seminal book, The Utility of Force. And the correspondence between the two is extraordinary. Who'd like to ask a question? The form now is that I'll nominate people to ask questions. If you can say who you are and what organisation you represent, and Richard will respond. And first one is the gentleman here at the front.
Ron Freeman, Atlantic Council of the United States, Washington.
Nice to see you.
General Shinseki, his estimate of how many soldiers would be necessary.
Yeah.
And how he got booted out. I wonder if you'd say something about that.
Yeah, that's probably the only anecdote that came to the public's attention where I don't know if you would call it pushback. You certainly saw a 4-star trying to be cautionary. That comment was made in Senate testimony. It wasn't made to the press or in some other venue in response to a direct question. General Shinseki acknowledged up front that he wasn't the warfighter and it wasn't his job to derive the war plan, but based on his experience in Bosnia, he thought at least several 100,000 soldiers would be required to do the job right in Iraq. He was very severely criticized by Paul Wolfowitz and effectively neutered for the remainder of his term as the Army chief. But the record does not show many statements like that, either in private or in public, by the 4-star community. Maybe as the documents become available in the future, a different picture will emerge, but I tend to doubt it. The military was not enthusiastic about invading Iraq, but the record doesn't show that there was vigorous discussion or respectful dissent put forward by the four-star community, and we cite that as a failing in the book.
I think, if I may, it's fair to say that this is where the US Constitution is different from the one here in Westminster, because the committees on the Hill expect general officers testifying to be candid, and indeed it can be difficult to get them to endorse your nomination for a senior post.
Right.
If the body of the committee thinks you're not candid.
Right.
And there's an account in Gates's memoir of how that affected the succession planning for some of the senior leadership. Gentleman here in the purple shirt.
Sure.
Clive Soley, member of the House of Lords and previously of the House of Commons and chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party under Tony Blair around the time of the Iraq War. And there's a lot in what you've said which is very interesting and reminds me of many things. But really I want to ask you that I supported Iraq. Supporting at the moment the movement of the British into Syria, but I have two concerns about both of them, which was the post-conflict situation. And it seems to me, I mean, you're talking about lessons encountered, I'm talking about lessons learned, because we didn't have a proper post-conflict situation.
Yeah.
We didn't identify people who could manage a state, and we didn't know how to police it, although we had done that much better, actually after the Second World War, in a number of countries that have been occupied. So I wonder if you can be, bearing in mind that I'm thinking very much of Syria at the moment, are we doing, and is the US doing, the sort of thinking that needs to be done on the post-conflict and management of a country after collapse of this kind?
Well, I think not. I think not. For many of the reasons, I think many of the disabilities of our system are playing out again in the approach to Syria, or the lack of an approach to Syria. We had the opportunity to provide a team of some 6 experts or so early in General Allen's tenure to provide him some informed advice and some thinking as he began his tenure as the special envoy. But very quickly it became apparent that he had not been empowered to do anything. So what we see we see something like a strategy that exists in public documents. We have 9 lines of effort that are identified, but there's no entity that's empowered to synergize or coordinate or integrate them, so they're operating more or less independently, which is a very suboptimal way to conduct matters. This is not the kind of thing that can be done in the White House and should not be done in the White House. So, but I think it goes back to an even more fundamental problem, and a problem that we saw certainly in the decision process to invade Iraq, which is to achieve a real consensus among all the people that matter about what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So professional researchers always begin with trying to define the problem. We don't see a lot of evidence that there was a strenuous attempt to A, define exactly what the problem was, and then B, to think through the second and third order effects of our contemplated courses of action, which is critical. So we look to the beginning, but we rarely look to the middle and to the end, and we find ourselves in a very stressful situation where to achieve the results that we want would require a dramatic increase in resources. We haven't laid the groundwork in terms of building popular support and public opinion, so presidents and prime ministers are reluctant to take that big step, and we find ourselves again and again, in the case of the United States now 3 times, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, in this sort of no-win, no-lose middle ground, which is hateful for all concerned, because we can't move forward and we can't move back. No president wants to lose a war on his watch, so we put enough resource and effort in to keep the ball moving, but not enough to bring the conflict to termination. We make a clear recommendation in the book, never again to engage in large-scale counterinsurgency, because we think 3 times is enough. If we haven't learned our lessons in 3 big goes or bites at the apple, I don't know what we're going to learn. This is a very unpopular position in Washington, but I hold to it myself anyway. And that is that the advice that was rendered by General Powell, lo these many years ago, has got history on its side. So where you have a clear objective, strong popular support, overwhelming resources, and limited aspirations, you're likely to be successful. And where you don't, you're likely to fail. And I think we see many of these kinds of dimensions in the current debate about Syria. We really do. To really solve the problem in Syria would require a level of effort that none of us, I think, are willing to sign up for at this point in time, anyway.
Desmond Byrne?
I'm a member of the Institute. Can I just go back to your point about politics? And you were talking about politics just now. And, I mean, ultimately, the success or failure of interventions is about the political settlement results. We talked about Maliki and his sectarian approach and his failure to espouse the views of the coalition, and ultimately to go down a path which was which was Shiite and separatist, and it was divisive within Iraq. I mean, when you think about your lessons, do you think also about how it is you get to the point where the local domestic political settlement can be achieved, and the extent to which either that needs to be imposed by the interveners or the extent to which it needs to be very severely shaped by the interveners? A nice contrast, for example, the Dayton Agreement, which was in imposition, on Bosnia, a small country, but then enforced by military, as against Iraq, where there was a kind of democratic process and an unwillingness to impose the will of the coalition. I mean, for all sorts of good reasons, but nonetheless, that's not a recipe that seems to stand the test of time.
Right. It's natural for all of us, I think, to search for examples in our recent past that will guide us in the future, and certainly there was a lot of consideration given to what we thought we had learned in the Balkans. The contending parties to Dayton came to the table as much as anything because they had been militarily exhausted on all sides. We had been able to empower the Bosnians and the Croats in particular to such a degree that the Serbs had suffered some major military defeats, and there was a willingness to stop shooting and to have an outside power come in and reorder affairs, I think. And this is a very different situation than what we found in Iraq at the time. I think a seminal question that should have been addressed at the time, but clearly was not, was if we link ourselves and our success to this host nation regime, do we assess that this regime is capable of being successful with our help or not? No general likes to be tied to a Maliki or a Karzai and have his success dependent upon the performance of that entity. We overestimated our ability to build the capacity of these governments and to overcome their inherent contradictions. These were corrupt regimes with a long history of government incapacity. Indeed, that's why there was a raging insurgency that quickly evolved in both countries, because you had a host nation government that lacked capacity across the board. In many cases, as we found in Vietnam, in many cases didn't seem to be particularly interested in making those evolutionary positive changes in rule of law, because of course that would directly impact their ability to profit from the war. And we know that the government leaders, virtually all of the government leaders in both of those countries amassed personal fortunes in the course of the war. So this is, again, one of the reasons that we felt that if we contemplate large-scale counterinsurgency wars in the future, we ought to be very, very dubious. There's a reason there's insurgency there, and we ought not to overestimate our ability to fix their internal problems unless we're willing to stay for 30 or 40 years, which I suspect in most cases we are not. I think we almost did a hand wave on the likelihood of the politics coalescing and rearranging themselves in Iraq such that there would be a stable, secular, multi-ethnic political settlement that would enable us relatively quickly to disengage and go home. I think we overestimated the prospects of that and our ability to bring that into being quite a bit, and we paid a very heavy price for it.
Gentleman right at the back of the left.
Thank you. Oliver Barton from the Ministry of Defence. I was struck by the seniority of your sponsor for this study, and I wondered if you could comment on how widespread at senior levels the appetite, let alone the aptitude, for identifying strategic lessons is within the US system.
I think these are good men, these are patriots, and increasingly women in our most senior positions now. I think they want to learn and they want to do better. I sincerely believe that, but they are prisoners of their own experience and their own development, and they operate inside a culture which makes strict demands upon them. It's a culture that requires them to compete with their sister services. It's a culture that requires them to spend the vast majority of their careers in tactical assignments which don't contribute to the kind of skills and outlook that we think are required at the very top. So there are lots and lots of reasons why significant improvement in performance is going to be a real challenge for us. The Secretary of Defense right now, Ash Carter, is looking seriously at making civilian graduate school opportunities available to a much broader segment, because he's become convinced that broadens the outlook of future senior leaders in a very healthy and positive way. We'll have to see if the economics will support that, and we'll have to see if the military cultures support that. Because if you can identify a David Petraeus or an H.R. McMaster at the captain level, then this can be a great thing. If what happens is the favorite son of the general gets sent off to Princeton, not because he has the intellectual capacity and equipment to profit from that, but because he's the favorite son of the general, then this experiment will fail. So.
James Cunliffe.
Yes, James Cunliffe, SCS Limited. You answered that question, or my question to a certain extent, in terms of State Department and USAID perhaps learning their own lessons.
Yeah.
You talked about the generals needing to be media savvy. I mean, wasn't it a case that perhaps they were a bit too media, their profiles were too great in the media, and that what you really want is civilian leadership in the field. You know, Sergio de Mello was killed in Iraq, he was the UN SRSG, and no one really emerged from the American side as a civilian
Right.
boy who's got a civilian political background.
Yeah.
It's always what did Petraeus do, what did McChrystal do, what did, you know.
Yeah, I would accept Ryan Crocker I would agree with you in general. I think Ambassador Crocker is an exception to that general rule. I would define media savvy as not being media interested or media busy. Sometimes being media savvy means that you're very conservative about your press engagements and what you say in them. It makes sense to know who you're talking to and why you're talking to them. I think the General Officer Corps was flabbergasted when it came to light that General McChrystal was embedding a Rolling Stone reporter over a period of weeks and months. That's certainly not being media savvy. You can't be unguarded for weeks on end. You just can't. General Petraeus, in most of his career in uniform anyway, was always very, very careful about this sort of thing. But General McChrystal, as a special operations general, had very limited opportunities to engage with the media for obvious reasons. And now he found himself in the public spotlight, and we think he was not really prepared to operate at that level of theater command. It was a poor choice in our opinion. Probably would have been a wonderful choice to be the U.S. SOCOM commander, and undoubtedly would have been very successful there. But as a theater commander, we don't think that his background and experiences well suited him for that position.
I wonder if I could just make an additional remark. A good example of a civilian politician who effectively became the combined joint interagency multinational leader was Paddy Ashdown in Bosnia, which he has described very well in his book Swords into Ploughshares, bearing in mind that there wasn't much of a threat in Bosnia at the time. And I saw for myself that this worked. But in addition, the two American commanders of the NATO Stabilization Force, S4, had both deliberately, effectively subordinated S4 to him as the political authority. And at every level, there was an extremely good working relationship. So maybe this is the easy exception that proves the rule. Now, time marches on. Could those of you who want to ask a question, could you just raise your hand so I can... shall we take them all of a one-er?
Sure.
And then you can ask whichever
However you
aspects of the questions
I'll try to
you
remember.
like. And I'll start with Howard Bodie.
How about the you haven't said much about allies.
Right.
Could you possibly comment on the benefits and drawbacks of working with allies in these two campaigns?
Yeah, our assessment specifically included any number of very worthy parts to the whole story, and that was one of them. But very briefly, a couple of major points that occur to me anyway. The first is that the importance of experience in working in multinational environments for senior officers really can't be overstated. I suppose one of the blessings of the long war has been that American officers have been brought into that environment in a way that they really had not been previously. So that's a good thing. But now we're retreating back into our familiar ways. We've all but withdrawn from Europe. Service overseas is not seen as being particularly career enhancing in the military, and we're going to have to wrestle with this yet again in the future. In that regard, what we see the British forces doing in the U.S. military is very interesting. So you're posting even flag officers, brigadiers, throughout, the American military, which gives us an opportunity at home anyway to interact with senior British officers, which I think is a pretty intelligent way to keep these relationships going and to expand your influence abroad. We're not really seeing that on the American side in any kind of meaningful way. There was a lot of resentment on the part of American commanders about national caveats. Our view, the view of the research group that put this study together, was in the long run, fighting with allies is almost always better. They lend a lot of political legitimacy and cover for what you're trying to do, and we think one of the hardest parts about this decision to invade Iraq was that key allies, long-time key allies, expressed grave reservations, and those reservations were swatted aside. And we now know that there was some real merit to the misgivings of the French and the Germans and some others into going into Iraq that should have been more carefully listened to. So those alliance and partner relationships, which go back decades and even centuries in some cases, are there for a reason. There's a commonality of interests that enables those relationships and suggests that they should be listened to. We don't think they were listened to the degree that they should have been at the time. And we don't think that American generals, it's certainly true that it's logistically annoying to support multiple small partners. There's no question about it, when their contribution on the battlefield may be limited. But their other contributions are many and are important, and they need to be factored into the equation. And our politicians generally get that, which is why we build large coalitions whenever we can.
Richard, what I'd like to do now is ask all the remaining questioners just to give us a short burst on each of their questions, and then you can answer what you like or whatever of them. So, who else is there left? Gentleman on the aisle?
Stephen Johns, member of the Institute. You described at the time of the Iraq surge that there was an alternative recommendation that was supported unanimously by the military. Could you describe what that was, and also why it was that the surge prevailed? You mentioned a superior presentation, but were there other factors that caused the surge to prevail over the military's recommendation?
Okay, who else do we have? Gentleman in the back?
Thanks. Neil Bartow, PhD candidate at Birkbeck College. I was just wondering, something that's come up is the requirement for both members of the military and the political establishment to become better versed in each other's disciplines. We've heard a little bit about graduate programs and Paddy Ashdown's experience in Bosnia. I was wondering if you could elaborate further on any other concrete recommendations you see for improvement.
Okay, who else have we got left? The corner?
Lindsay Clutterbuck, member of the Institute. Just picking up on your comment about three counterinsurgency wars. Certainly the last two, Afghanistan and Iraq, didn't start off as insurgencies.
Right.
They started off with invasions, which then set the conditions for insurgencies to emerge. Hence you need the counterinsurgency.
Right.
So perhaps there needs to be a bit of work on this sort of transition between one and the other.
Right.
Anyone else?
David Richmond, member of the Institute and formerly Foreign Office, also in Baghdad 2003-2004. really picking up on the last question, the point about media, it's really a comment. You've spoken a little bit about how the military and indeed the political side handled the press, but it was, and the media, it was nearly always facing back towards Washington and London. There was very little effort to explain to the Iraqis, at least, what their fate was, what was going to happen. Indeed, they knew nothing about the political process until November, December 2003, 8 months after the invasion, with no idea what their future, what lay in store for them in the future. It is not perhaps surprising that you see an insurgency gathering pace, and that is surely one lesson to be learned. You have to communicate with the people that you are effectively occupying.
Right.
Okay, we're almost into the last orders here. Anyone else? So there we are, 4 very diverse questions.
Okay.
Richard, respond as you like.
The best military advice proffered in the summer and early fall of 2006 was essentially to drive on with the campaign plan to transition to Iraqi control and move into an overwatch, advise, and assist mode. There were some other courses of action that were talked about and briefly considered. One was a precipitous withdrawal. One was a suggestion that was put forward by Senator Biden at the time and some others, Leslie Gelb, I think, at the council, to create sort of catch basins where we would essentially go hands off. We would allow the factions to fight it out, but we would focus on humanitarian assistance and trying to cope with the human cost of that sort of course of action. A pretty crazy suggestion, in my opinion, but it was one that was put out there in some magazine articles and so on. And we need to note in passing that the Joint Chiefs, who are really paid to be man training equipped generals, not warfighting generals, sincerely felt that the surge ran a very high risk of breaking the force, in particular in the Army and the Marine Corps. Their early experiences had been informed by Vietnam, and it's a fact that when we sent the professionals, the sergeants and the officers back for their third tour in Vietnam, the Army more or less collapsed on us. And everyone thought the same thing would happen this time around. It did not, because it was a different army. It was a purely professional army that was composed of some very different people, and remarkably it managed to endure and to hold together, although I think you're all aware of the human cost that we will be paying for many decades, the stresses that were put on those soldiers in many cases, and we cite the particulars in the book, went back 3 and 4, in some cases even 5 times for year-long deployments. So the service chiefs had a point. The president, if you want to know who the author of the surge was, a lot of people have come forward since and claimed responsibility for the surge in Iraq. You really have to give the credit to President Bush. He deserves the criticism that he's endured for many other decisions, but I think you have to give the credit to him. It was a courageous decision to go against not only his military, but against the media and many of the leaders in his own party to make this decision. So the transition to coin. It's certainly true, and we discuss it in the book, that counterinsurgency was not foreseen when we invaded Iraq, and it was not foreseen when we went into Afghanistan. We note in passing that we probably should have done some contingency planning in that regard, and we certainly should have dusted off the lessons, and there were many. There have been many efforts made to collect lessons learned from Vietnam. They appear to have disappeared from the archives, I suppose. They certainly weren't found in our doctrine to any great degree. Jim Petraeus actually wrote his dissertation at Princeton on lessons learned from the Vietnam conflict. So I suppose it was fortuitous that we put him in charge in that. But you're absolutely correct when you note that in the beginning these were seen as conventional military, something like state-on-state operations and not on counterinsurgency. We were forced to fall back and adapt on that. We didn't say a whole lot about strategic communications. It certainly doesn't seem to be a strength in Western democracies. I suspect because overwhelmingly the impulse will be to pay attention to our domestic constituencies, and we're much less interested and concerned with how what we're doing and how it's articulated is presented in the populations, in the actual theater of war itself. And I agree that we need to do much better in future at that. We need to organize for that. Our interagency is not organized to do that, and it's a serious weakness. And we're seeing it played out in Syria when the lead for messaging is the State Department Office of Public Diplomacy, which is an awful choice for that sort of thing, in my opinion. What was the question on civil-military understanding between the two? We need to do better, I guess. It was the PhD candidate.
Yeah.
Could you repeat again, please?
Yeah, just if you have any concrete recommendations apart from the stuff you said about graduate training programs.
Well, one point I think that's important to note when we're talking about the civilians and the military cooperating, both in Washington or in the Capitol and then in the theater of war. I would take exception to the Bosnian model in the following way. When you're not engaged in active conflict, in actual kinetic operations, there's no particular resistance to the idea of a civilian lead, as we saw in Bosnia. When you are engaged in kinetic operations, at least in the American context, you're never going to see acceptance of the idea of a civilian lead in the theater. The best that you can hope for is a Petraeus-Crocker serendipitous relationship where you've got simpatico leaders on both sides who are willing to cooperate, surrender their ego a little bit, merge organizations to some extent, as we saw in that time. That's about the best that you can hope for. A generalissimo that has all the civilians working for him, I don't think can work. Putting an ambassador or some sort of super envoy, as we saw for a period in Vietnam with Maxwell Taylor, it's just not going to work in our system because generals will not take strategic direction on the use of force in a kinetic environment from civilians other than from the Commander-in-Chief and the Secretary of Defense. If then. So this unity of effort is going to bedevil us on into the future. We were unable to achieve it inside the U.S., much less inside the coalition. And I suspect that to the extent that you ever achieve it, it's because of willing accommodation on the part of personalities who are not serving 6 or 12-month tours. They are there long enough to form a sort of a common approach and a common identity and a common effort. And if you don't have that, then you're going to have suboptimal performance, and you'd better plan for it. So, how do we bring these two sides together? I don't know that it's possible to do that. Sending a handful of officers to civilian graduate school is a wonderful idea, but it's expensive and it's going to be resisted by the military services, who will wait out a president and a secretary who think that that's a smart thing to do. And in the same way, we can say that our political leaders ought to have some sort of strategic training before they become secretaries and presidents, but there's no way to actually bring it into being. You know, they get to office because they're accomplished politicians, and that's a different skill set from being an effective governor, chief executive, or certainly a war leader. So I guess what we can say, though, is that if you back out and take the long view, as suboptimal as it has been for 2 centuries for us, it's worked out okay. We've managed to overcome, these weaknesses because of our other strengths. But I don't have a high optimism that we're going to make a big dent in this problem anytime soon.
Richard, well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for some very high protein questions, and thank you for your response to them. Richard, thank you for your fascinating briefing, which but touches upon what's in the book. And, just as a sort of random soundbite, I was struck where in the introduction it discusses strategic communications. It emphasises the US failure by saying this is the nation that has Hollywood and Madison Avenue, both of whom owe their success to strategic communications. On the evidence of your presentation and reading the introduction and conclusion, I think that there's some really heavyweight points in here. And it's fantastic that the NDU both allows it to be downloaded from their website and actually, until the cupboard is empty, is prepared to mail you copies through the US mail if you want hard copies. None of this is very easy, and indeed, the multiple difficulties and known unknowns of this, I'm sure, will be exposed all day in the debate in the House of Commons tomorrow. And what I'd like to do is actually quote from the final paragraph of the book And this was not written by the excellent team of authors from the NDU. This was written by somebody who actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature. See if you can work out who it was. Let us learn our lessons. Never, never, never believe that any war will be smooth or easy, or that anyone who embarks on the strange voyage can measure the tides and hurricanes that he will encounter. The statesman who yields to war fever must realise that once the signal is given, he is no longer the master of policy, but the slave of unforeseeable and uncontrollable events. Antiquated war offices, weak, incompetent or arrogant commanders, untrustworthy allies, hostile neutrals, malignant fortune, ugly surprises and awful miscalculations. They all take their seats at the council board on the morrow of a declaration of war. Always remember, however sure that you are, that you can easily win, that there would not be a war if the other man did not think he also had a chance. Anyone recognise the author? Yes, it's Winston Churchill from his very readable book, My Early Life, which really also fuses together the tactical and operational and strategic and has some marvellous anecdotes. But would you please join in with me in thanking Richard for